Shirley, it's getting late and church is ready to start. Do you think Daddy's having trouble finding a parking space?
Oh, hi, Sharon.
Hi, Bev. How are you?
Good, thanks. Is this your little girl?
Yes, this is Shirley. Shirley, this is Mrs. Bathurst. She's from Australia. Could you say hello to her? Shirley, you need to say hi. I'm sorry, she's really shy, and she's been up most of the night because her teeth are hurting her.
Well, that was quite a little scenario that we just saw, Anne Marie, and I think that, to be fair, we've all been there with a child that maybe in that moment just felt like not saying anything. What's tonight's lesson about?
Tonight's lesson is going to be on respecting age, and we'll be covering many principles that will help you as a parent learn how can we demonstrate respect for age.
In fact, the key principle that we want you to be reminded of all the way through this particular session is this: love is not rude. Get ready. We'll be right back with our class. Well, it's amazing to think we are already in our 7th session. We're really in the middle of our character development series, and in this particular session, we're going to talk about the single category of honoring and respecting age. In fact, if you go right to your outline, I want to get started speaking to this very issue. We believe if there has been anything lost in our society, and certainly to our social detriment over the last 50 years of this century, it is the way we deal with respect for age. In the past, children were taught on a regular basis. They were taught in the communities, they were taught in churches, they were taught in school to respect and honor age. Age was an honored institution in our society, but it seems that today the elderly among us are tolerated, and tomorrow, if no change comes in attitude, then the elderly will be viewed as a social burden. The frightening prospect to all of this is that those elderly people in the future really is you and I. And it's frightening to think that those who will be voting on our old age legislation is the present generation of children who have grown or have never been taught to be sensitive to age. So I think that you would want to understand this with a great sense of urgency. Let's talk about this issue of respecting age. This is, again, the single category that we're going to take up in this particular session. Number one, let's look at the commands. Respect for age. Leviticus 19:32. Let me set the scene for you. The children of Israel are coming out of Egypt. In Egypt, age was not necessarily respected. In fact, because of the way they were treated in Egypt, if you could not make bricks anymore, then you were not worth the allotment of food. So the aged ones were not greatly respected. So when God called the children of Israel out of Egypt, and He began to give them His laws that would represent His character to all the nations of the world, and when He introduced, you have to think about it from their perspective, Leviticus 19:32, when He introduced, "Thou shalt rise up before the gray-headed and honor aged one, and you shall reverence your God, I am the Lord." And understanding that the literal rendering of this verse means this: in the face of gray hairs you shall rise up and you shall honor the face of the old man, thus fear your God. That concept, ladies and gentlemen, was a radically new concept to the children of Israel. They've never heard this before. You know it because your moms and dads taught it to you, and so when you finally read it in Scripture, it did make sense. But from their perspective, they never heard this before. And the heart and mind of God is clearly and distinctively telling the children of Israel and all of the nations His mind when it comes to respecting age. Job 12:12 teaches us that for wisdom is with the aged man, longer life is with understanding. And this is the bottom line. This is something that you want to put into your children. This is a handy way for them to bless God. Every virtuous act towards age is credited as a virtuous act towards God. Isn't that exciting? To think that your children, you can instill this very truth in your children to help them understand that when they do those little and big special things for those older people in our society, and by the way, you are an older person, I'm an older person, that in fact God is saying that it's as if it's a credit towards me. That's a way that your children can bless God. You can tell them they can be a blessing to God. Well, where do we begin? Let's practically talk to this issue. Let's look at some of the basics. How about this? Something your moms and dads taught you, I want to remind you. How about number one? Offering your seat to the elderly. Offering your seat to someone older. You know the scenario. You're in church, you're all sitting down, or you're at a function and there's no more seats and the elderly walk in, someone older. Or maybe your children are on a bus and there's no more seats. Teach your children in action how they can honor age. Very simple thing, as I talked about in our session 2 times ago. Teach your children to get up, to go to age, to invite them to take your seat. That little gesture is not only something beautiful. Remember, in that gesture, you are defining God to the world and helping the world find God. Here's another one. Open the door for age. If youth and age get to the door at the same time, instead of rolling over the older person, teach your children to stop, to think, to grow sensitive to the moment. Open the door. Then let that aged person go through. And then if your child wants to buzz by them, do so carefully. But honor them by doing something like that. Or another favorite, especially as Anna Marie and I are getting older, honoring age at buffet lines. I mean, you know the church gathering or you're at a family gathering, and so often what moms want to do is get that little one fed. Moms, bring some crackers. Do something very beautiful. Let age go first. We do that whenever we have a gathering at our home or even our church. One of the first things we want to do is we want to look and see, if when it's practical, of course, to look and see, is there someone of age here that we can honor, that we can say, please, be our guest, you go first. All of these things that I've just given you, opening the door, offering your seat for the elderly, honoring age by the buffet line, these are not biblical mandates. Please understand that. These are vehicles delivering biblical principles. Some of God's moral laws are very specific. Do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal, do not prefer, again, the rich over the poor. Those are very specific commands. But some of God's moral laws are less specific and more general. Let me give you an example. What is the biblical justification for not spitting on the sidewalk? I mean, you're walking down the road with your little one and they decided to just do that. Or what's the biblical justification? You got this child, and this child's at the dinner table, and this child is chewing. You've talked to him about this, chewing like a barn animal. And then mom, and they got goo coming out of the mouth. And you know, I've talked to you about this, and you're chewing like a pig. And your theologically astute son says to you, well, Mom, I appreciate the enthusiasm that you have for controlling this behavior, but could you show me in the Bible where it says I'm not supposed to chew like a barn animal? By what authority do you say this? Got a good point there. I checked for you. There's nothing in Scripture. There is nothing that says thou shalt not chew like a barn animal. There is nothing in Scripture that says thou shalt not spit on the sidewalk. So what are you going to do, moms? Let me share with you a couple of great verses that will satisfy these questions. And these are verses you could take home and work with your children immediately because, well, they need to be applied right away. Teach your children 1 Corinthians 13:5 and teach your children Titus 3:2. 1 Corinthians 13:5, moms, are you ready, dads? It says this. This is the biblical injunction. It says, love is not rude. Love is not rude. Titus 3:2 tells us, be courteous to all men. So when you see your child and they're chewing like that barn animal, and even if they don't ask, what you want to do is to bring to bear the general truth. You know, honey, the reason why mom is asking you to chew correctly is because love, something that we represent in this family because we're part of God's kingdom, love is not rude. Or be courteous to all men. There are a number of different examples of that. Let me introduce one example. Let me talk about some of the moral minimums. One of our favorite topics that is so practical, that speaks to this issue about love not being rude, is what we call the interrupt rule. The interrupt rule. Let me set the stage for you. You know when you're having this adult conversation, two people are talking, and in the corner of your eye, you see their little child coming running over to mom with urgency. And you're still having this conversation, you're speaking to that mom, but that child comes right up to mom and begins to pull on mommy, 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 mommy. And even though you're talking to that mother, she immediately leaves you and she turns to the child and she says, yes, you, my little darling, you who is the center of the universe, don't worry about the fact that I was talking to another human being made in the image and likeness of God. And them. What do you want, darling? You know that scenario? That is the opposite of love is not rude. That is rude. There is a much better way. Don't let that be your children. Your children to be reflectors of God. When your children have a need, teach your children, you're talking to another person, teach your children to go up and put their hand just on mom's side, dad's side. What that hand means is this. Mom, Dad, I know you're talking to another person who is important to God. I have a particular need. When you get a chance to have a break in your conversation, may I ask you a question? That's what it means. And what's it going to be? 15 seconds, 20 seconds before you will say to the person you're talking to, excuse me one moment. And then you go to the child. If you want to let your child know that you know they're there, you could also just take your hand, put it over their hand, and just give them a gentle little squeeze. This means Mommy knows you're there, and I'm going to be with you in just a moment. But this is beautiful because you're fulfilling then 1 Corinthians 13:5. You're fulfilling Titus 3:2. Love is not rude. Be courteous to all men. Ladies and gentlemen, listen, this is the key phrase we've been working through with you. This is what it looks like. You see, what good is all that theology that you have? What good is all of that memorization if you don't know what it looks like on Monday morning? This is what it looks like. The interrupt rule, this is what it looks like on Monday morning. The benefits of the interrupt rule, what are we really teaching our children? Here's an example. It becomes a vehicle for the child to demonstrate and place honor on others while at the same time communicating a need to parent. The child also learns to trust the parent, that his or her needs are going to be met in an orderly way. It helps the child gain the self-discipline of patience. It reinforces the positive side of the child's conscience. Thus, confirmation comes from within the heart of the child as well as from without. It also communicates to the third party involved the standards of respect and honor you as a family are living by. Now remember this, when you honor age, when you honor other people, when you prefer other people, you're honoring God. Here's another vehicle that demonstrates both 1 Corinthians 13:5 and Titus 3:2. How about this? Something really simple. When you get up from the table, you know, as a family, you're sitting around, or let's say that you're in a restaurant, and all the family is sitting there, and we're all done now. When you get up, when you back that chair up to get out, teach your children to put the chair back in. It's a simple little gesture. Can I find you a verse? Can't find a verse on that. The only verse I can find, or two verses, is love is not rude and be courteous to all men. Because leaving the chair out, let's face it, sometimes we just can't get to each other. We're tripping over the chairs, or if we're in the home, mom is left to put all the chairs back. What does it look like? Putting a chair in. It's a simple gesture, but in so doing, especially in a public setting, you are defining God to the world to help the world find God. Something so basic. Here's another one. Let's talk about this. Number 4 on your outline. Honor guests in your home by teaching your children to stand. Now follow this, please. Mr. Ezzo comes over. He's going to visit you. And let's say that you have some older children. Let's say you have 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old children, some teenagers. Right. What would happen if I walked in the room? Now, I realize there are certain moral minimums that we do expect. If you say to your children, kids, would you say hello to Mr. Ezzo? The moral minimum, at least that I would get back, is a hello. And that's good. But you could probably do better, even do best, really. Would you consider, when a guest comes into your house, that you would have your children actually stand? Just stand up. When they see a guest, I'm not talking about someone who comes and goes all the time, but when a new visitor, Dad, you bring someone home from work. Or maybe we're bringing in a new family home from church and your kids are just meeting for the first time. And so you walk into the living room and say, kids, and they see that you're coming, and without a word, your children just stand up. What a picture of beauty in a world that doesn't know beauty. What a sense of honor that takes place when something like that happens. I mean, your children may sit there, they're watching ESPN, they have the remote in their hands, you say, this is Mr. Ezzo, and they say, hi there, and then they mute the guest and go back to ESPN. You know what? Christianity is not a religion of mediocrity. We're here to define God to the world. We're here because of moral excellence. Philippians 1:10 says, approve that which is excellent. The word approve means to test the way of excellence. The word excellent means go over and beyond. Go beyond. The idea here is don't do just the minimums. Go beyond. Finally, in terms of respecting age, let's talk about Mr. and Mrs. Whatever happened to Mr. and Mrs.? We believe, Anne-Marie and I believe, it is morally correct for children to use the titles of respect in terms of endearment. Titles such as Mr. and Mrs. or, when appropriate, Sir and Ma'am. And certainly terms of endearment such as Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, Aunt, Uncle, even cousin. You see, those are terms of endearment. All of those terms signify a special relationship to the child. Mommy is not Joyce. Of all the women in the world, there's only one woman that is called Mom. Dad is not Phil. Of all the men in the world, gentlemen, there's only one man called Daddy. That's you. You're not your child's peer. When starting out early on, you're not even to be their buddy or their pal. Now, I know we say that, hey, little buddy. And I say that with my grandchild. I say it with little RJ, Amy's little one. I say, who's your buddy? And of course, I got him trained with gum. Grandpa's my buddy. But you know what? In the truest sense, we're not. When we put these values into their hearts as they grow and mature, the day will come when we will be best friends. But that's not now. Our job is to bring them to that point morally. You guys, as fathers, as mothers, you're not their pals, you're not their peers, you're their mom and you're their dads. The notion that society would be better off if we eliminated age distinctions is relatively new. It only came into existence in the last 35 years. That's when we dropped the Mr. and Mrs. from our social vocabulary. There were those who were opposed to this. There were people who actually believed that if children would call adults by their first names, that they would actually feel more loved and more accepted. They would feel closer to adults. It certainly was an interesting theory, but it was greatly flawed because children do not feel closer to adults by calling adults by their first names. In fact, quite the opposite. I want you to know, and I know that some of you have experienced this because we have seen your children. When Mr. Ezzo enters your child's world and reaches down to touch their little life, it means a whole lot more to them knowing that Mr. Ezzo did that than that Gary simply did that. That's the point. Mr. and Mrs. signifies a separation. Do you know what Mr. and Mrs. means to a child? This is what it means. Time has not made us equal. That's what the Mr. and Mrs. category and designation means. Time has not made us equal. You have lived life. You have wisdom. You have experience. I am but a child. I am still growing. I am still learning. So when a child uses the title Mr. and Mrs., they are paying honor on your age, honor on your position, honor on your status. You have to understand that legitimate closeness with children is built on a number of relational factors, but first name calling is not one of them. You could experiment in your own Sunday school settings with the power of Mr. and Mrs. If you have a Sunday school setting, maybe a Awana program or some Sunday night program, and maybe things are a little bit out of control. We've already done this a couple of times. You take two Sunday school classes, children of the same age. Let one Sunday school class call the teacher by the first name, Teacher Mary. Let the other Sunday school class call the teacher by Mrs. Smith. The difference is profound. In 1 week, you will be able to see the difference. The children who call and address the teacher by Mr. or Mrs., that class has more order to it. That class has more respect. That class feels closer to that teacher. That class has a greater amount of satisfaction, a greater amount of learning. You go back to the teacher that is just first name with all those children, have that peer perspective. What you'll end up with is usually a class that has much more chaos. The students have less self-control. There's more disrespect. There's less learning takes place. Now, why is that so? Because children respond to the title. There's a type of security that is associated with the separation and the distinctions of age. We believe, yes, you should teach your children to use Mr. and Mrs. Now, some of you, I know, you're hearing this for the first time. You're thinking, I don't want any children call me by my last name. That was Mrs. Jones. That was my mother-in-law, you would say. Look, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why you say those things is because you have this excuse. You say, but it's going to make me feel old. Have you heard anyone say that? The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, you sitting in this class, you are old. You are all old. You have children. You have your own car. You have your own home. You have your own insurance policy. Old people have those things. In the mind of a child that is 3, 10, even 15, you are old. Therefore, live to that standard. Acknowledge where God has taken you. There is a type of honor that is due you for no other reason, God said, than simply you have lived this long and gained this experience. The other thing regarding Mr. and Mrs., it's really funny. Who's got the problem? When you think about it, who's got the problem? I guarantee you, your children will not have a problem going over to Mr. and Mrs. And you say, well, Mommy, why are we going to do that? We used to just call him Tony and her Belinda. Why are we going to call Mr. and Mrs. Weatherby? Well, honey, we have learned something, that it is better that we use Mr. Weatherby and Mrs. Weatherby. Okay. The children don't have a problem with this. Only parents have the problem with this, and so we ask you to give consideration to this. What does Mr. and Mrs. do? Is it a biblical command? Nope, it's not. It's not. But what it is it is a vehicle that demonstrates honor on age. Now, if you could come up with another vehicle of equal status that represents the mind of God in this, that's fine. Will Mr. and Mrs. be true in every society? Of course not. We have traveled to Asia. Over there, uncle. I would be called Uncle Gary. That is the utmost sign of respect. Anne-Marie would be an aunt in some societies. That is a sign of respect. But in our society, in many of the Western societies, Mr. and Mrs. is a title of respect. It's a child understanding and acknowledging we're not equal. We're equal before God. We're equal in a court of law. But in terms of life experience, let me pay honor on you. And then each subsequent generation does the same. That's how it works. Right now, we're going to go to our wrap-up session with Anne-Marie. I know that she has a lot of thoughts that she wants to add to what I've said already. We're also going to look at the scenario. Most importantly, we're going to start taking your questions, because we know through your questions, you're going to help us refine our teaching. So let's do that right now. Well, Anne Marie, I'm glad that you are by my side in this wrap-up so we can go a little bit further with this all-important lesson, respecting and honoring age. Some of your thoughts?
Well, I know that because there was a lot of information that was given, you probably have lots of questions to ask, but just a couple of things that I would just like to remind you about. As you are writing the standard on your children's conscience, and for some of you, you're learning some new standards for your own moral warehouse. Just keep asking yourself, when you're presented with facts, what does it look like? When you're having your own devotions, reading the book of Proverbs, and you're reading these different verses, say, what does this look like? Because that will help you to internalize so that you can then help your children internalize the values. And the other thing, too, when you stop and look at where our society is at today, with the lack of respect for elders particularly, what an awesome opportunity you have as a generation to really show our society God's beauty and reflect that. So on those days, particularly when it seems like, are they getting anything? And it gets so discouraging. Think of the big picture, what it is that you're working towards, and what an awesome privilege you really have to be able to reflect God in just basic ways of just your children showing honor and respect to elders. So those are just a couple of reminders. And then I know when we've got our vignette that we need to look at yet, and there'll be some more teaching that we can do in that, and then we'll take your questions, and there'll be a lot more teaching we can do.
Honey, let's go to that vignette. That vignette is really important because that is probably another one of those vignettes that happens all too often. Let's watch the negative side first, and let's see how this mom deals with that. Let's watch that vignette.
Shirley, it's getting late and church is ready to start. Do you think Daddy's having trouble finding a parking space?
Oh, hi, Sharon.
Hi, Bev. How are you?
Good, thanks. Is this your little girl?
Yes, this is Shirley. Shirley, this is Mrs. Bathurst. She's from Australia. Could you say hello to her? Shirley, you need to say hi. I'm sorry, she's really shy, and she's been up most of the night because her teeth are hurting her.
I think we could all relate with that scenario. More than once, probably, we have had children that, well, maybe embarrassed us in these moments. And the question comes down to, what are we going to do about it? In this particular scenario, the mother just simply made the excuse, my child is shy. Please remember that shyness is no excuse for disrespect. Shyness is an element of the temperament. There's nothing morally right or wrong with shyness, just like there's nothing morally right or wrong with a child that is overtly friendly. But the fact is, we cannot take these temperamental strengths and weaknesses and use them as an excuse for disrespect. There is a much better way that this could have been handled. In fact, let's go and see how the scenario would play out if the mom had this information. Let's watch this right now.
Shirley, it's getting late and church is ready to start. Do you think Daddy's having trouble finding a parking space?
Oh, hi, Sharon.
Hi, Bev. How are you?
Good, thanks. Is this your little girl?
Yes, this is Shirley. Shirley, this is Mrs. Bathurst. She's from Australia. Could you say hello to her? Shirley, you need to say hi. I'm sorry, Bev. We're really working on this. And when we get home, Shirley and I are going to have a talk about it. Aren't we, Shirley?
I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you saw something very beautiful, something very humbling. The natural tendency when our children do something that embarrasses us, when they fail to extend a courtesy back, of course we're going to attempt to make an excuse. I mean, we've heard them all. My child was up late last night and she didn't get enough sleep. When she doesn't get enough sleep, she's like this. Or I think my favorite has to be, she's cutting teeth. And ladies and gentlemen, the child in this scenario is about 8 years old. She's not cutting teeth anymore. The fact is, what you have to follow up on is what that mom did. When you find yourself in this situation, humble yourself before the mighty hand of God and simply say, use her words, I'm sorry. we're working on this. When your child doesn't come to the standard, when you insist on the child saying hello to Mr. Ezzo, and the child has decided, no, today is a good day to die. Today I'm not going to do it. That is when, instead of making excuses, you simply say, I'm sorry, we're working on it. And folks, when you get home, work on it. Don't do all of your parenting in public. There's a time when you just simply say, in your own heart, the child wins. When I get home, praise God, I know this is something we need to work more diligently on, right?
Right, and part of that working on it is before you even get into the situation. You know you're going to go somewhere and your children are going to meet other people. You start at home.
They get pretty ribbons in their hair.
Right. You say, you look really pretty this morning. Someone is going to tell you how nice you look. Now, depending on the age of the child, if it's a real young child, you go ahead and tell them. You need to say thank you. If it's an older child, maybe 3, 4, 5 and up, you might say, what will be the right thing to say? And you don't accept, and I don't know, say, oh, I think you do. And then they'll say, thank you. And they said, that's right, that would be the right thing to do. And for an even older child, once they start to hit 6 or 7, you might even say, and why is that the right thing to do? Because you always want to be evaluating, is it getting through? Is it reaching their heart to see if they know the moral reason why and can give it back to you? So, it's progressive, and obviously hopefully by the time they're 10 or 11, you don't have to do any of these pre-activity instruction, as it says, because if you do, they'll probably roll their eyes and say, Mom, I know I'm supposed to say thank you. So, give them the benefit of the doubt as they get older.
Right. Henny, let's fine-tune all of this teaching. Right now, respect for age, let's take your questions. And let's start right here.
My question deals with Mr. and Mrs. We have some friends who would be uncomfortable with that and would rather be referred to by the first name. What would we do with that?
Ooh, honey, what would they do with that?
You've got a couple of options. As Gary already said, there's not a verse that says thou shalt use Mr. and Mrs. So it's the principle that you want to reflect on, the issue of showing respect. If they're really, really close friends, sometimes you might address them as aunt or uncle, but you don't want to make everybody an aunt and uncle. It's fine to have a few close friends that are non-biological that your children call that. The other thing is you have to think about how often you see these people. For some, this might not be the hill that you're going to die on. You're just going to accept that and know that any new people that you meet, you're going to begin that process of introducing them to your children as Mr. and Mrs. There are still those that you are going to see on a regular basis. They're not that close that you feel comfortable of designating the aunt and uncle title to them. So you respectfully talk to those people and just share. We are in the process of teaching our children how to be respectful. And particularly nowadays, it seems that children really don't have respect for adults. And we really would appreciate it with our friendship if you would help us to teach this to our children. And just even say to them, part of the whole issue of Mr. and Mrs. is we want our children to understand, you have lived longer and you are wiser than they are. And we want them to realize that there are things they can learn from you. And if you're just first name, they might think of you as just another peer. And appeal to them in that manner.
Yeah, I wouldn't try to split the church over this.
Right.
But I think that you have to go lovingly with your conviction. If you've come to the conviction that you really do believe that Mr. and Mrs. is a way that your children can honor age, as Anne-Marie said, there may be a few exceptions, and that may become an aunt and uncle scenario. But for the most part, what we have found when most people hear the explanation why, that really paves the way for them to receive the Mr. and Mrs. acknowledgement from your children. Work on it. Don't split good relationships, but realize if you have convictions, you've got to lovingly go forward with those convictions. Good question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
And I would just like to encourage you, we've been there, with our own children, because this was something that we raised them with. And even when they were teenagers, there would be people that would say, oh, no, they even would say to the girls, just call us by our first names. Very respectfully, they would just say back to them, well, if you don't mind, I really would rather call you Mrs. and whatever their last name was. And invariably, those adults would come back to us and they said, you know, we really didn't like it at first, but the more they say it, the more we really like it. And then they began to notice that there really was a difference between between our girls and other kids as well, other teens that call them Mr. and Mrs. and those that didn't. So, you know, we're change agents. And but again, as Gary said, we don't want to split a church over.
Right. The moral reason why honoring age is a mandate. Right. In our society, this is one way we can do it. Let's take some other questions. Who else? Question? Okay, let's go right here, and then we'll come in front.
My question deals with the interrupt rule.
Mm-hmm.
At what age can we expect to find some success with that and start implementing that with our kids?
Our own children, they started teaching their children the interrupt rule at what age?
You really, about 18 months, you start teaching. Now, your question was, when can we expect it? Not usually at 18 months. But it's a good time to start because they do interrupt. And so you just gently take their little hand and say, no, when you want to talk to mommy, just put your, especially when you're talking, you know, with the other adult, just put your hand on my side. You know, maybe by the time they're 2, 2.5, they'll have it fairly consistent. But definitely, you know, if you start at 18 months, by the time they're 3, it'll pretty much be a part of them. And it's a matter of doing some role playing. You know, if you've got other friends that are studying and doing the same thing, you kind of do it together. And so all of those things encourages. Those of you that's starting with a child that's a little bit older, you still give them a learning time.
And I think if you have older siblings, I know that we have some in here who have older siblings, as the younger ones watch the older ones, it almost becomes a natural process. So it's almost like get the oldest ones, and there's a domino effect. Okay? Let's come right up front. We have another question, Tony, right here.
My question also has to do with the interrupt rule, and I'm wondering how we should address situations where our children may be faced with an emergency and they need to get a hold of us right away.
So this just standing here and they can't wait.
And little
You know,
brother's
the kitchen's
about to
on
fall out
fire,
of the
and
high
you
chair.
want to know that. Well, you also have we might as well throw into this one the mix. What are you going to do when they're in the car seat or the back seat and they can't put their hand on your shoulder? Do they just raise their hand and hope you look in the rearview mirror? Let's deal with that.
And that's a good question because that has happened to some little child that was waiting and he really had an emergency that he needed to report. There is the context. You know, we learned that way back in one of the earlier lessons about how context plays in. So there will be those emergencies that come in, and so the child will just say, "Excuse me, Mom and Dad, you know, there's a fire in the backyard." I mean, and that was truly a scenario that a friend of ours had, and the child is waiting, and it's like, "You're not interrupting properly." And it's finally says, "Now, what is it?" "We have a fire in the backyard," you know, and it's like, so you want to give them that opportunity. And from the car, that's another situation. Most of your time, hopefully most of your time is not spent in the car, so that when you are there, the child can just say, "Excuse me, Mom," and loud enough, or "May I ask a question," as opposed to, excuse me, you know, that one time.
You know, and I think the one time is a key, honey. Tony, most of the time the interrupt rule is going to work because your children are going to interrupt you in non-emergency situations. When that becomes a pattern, then you all will know that when that emergency comes and the child says, "But I can't wait, I need to tell you," that is the exception. But the norm is it's going to work. But that's good. Go ahead, honey.
And I think one other place, too, is at the dinner table. Obviously, you know, if they want to interrupt someone else, you're not going to have hands all over the place. So, I mean, some of our families, depending on how many children you have, because, you know, elder, you've got 7, you've got 5, I mean, that's a lot of little voices that you could have around the table. And until they mature sufficiently to know when it's appropriate to interrupt, we have had some of our families, the kids will just raise their hand, and then you get acknowledged.
Not just raise their hand, "May I speak," but
Right.
But Mom and Dad are talking, and the child wants to get Mom's attention. And in that scenario, you know, they raise their hand to get Mom's
Right,
attention.
so you don't have all kinds of
Right.
voices at one time.
Okay, let's get one more question. A couple more questions. Let's come over here.
My question deals with Mr. and Mrs. And when do our children, or do they ever transition as they reach toward adulthood from calling those who are older Mr. and Mrs. to calling them by their first name, or do they always keep the respect of Mr. and Mrs.?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. That's going to be determined by your own family. I'll tell you what happened in our family. As our children moved into the adult community as married women, many of the relationships that were Mr. and Mrs., such as Mrs. Carter, to our kids now, it is Kathy, because our children moving into the adult community, that adult peer group opens up. So you could have your child could be 23 or 24 and still be a peer with a person who is 44. That is not the same thing as a child who is 4 being a peer with a 24-year-old. Same thing, 20 years. But once you move into the adult community, that's when usually many of these opportunities open up where you may feel comfortable going first name, but not always. Right. Some of our children, with some of the friends that we have, older friends, to them, they will always be Mr. and Mrs. because they're of our age category, and our children just do not feel comfortable by addressing them by their first name. And that's a judgment call each person makes in their own heart to place honor on the person they're speaking to.
You know, there's people that we've known for a long. We still call them Mr. and Mrs.
Right.
You know, so it's just a matter of that.
Let's take just a few more. We've got one right back here.
My question is also regarding Mr. and Mrs. We have small children at home. What would they call a babysitter who's maybe anywhere between age 12 to 16? Do they say Mr. and Mrs. to the last name or Miss?
If it's a female babysitter, what our children did, when they were babysitting, that's when it was Miss Amy or Miss Jenny. They didn't go to the full Miss Ezzo, but they did add a little bit of honor because of the authority that those babysitters represented in the life of that child. They went to Miss Amy or Miss Jenny. Okay. And one more right here.
My question has to do with respect for age. Gary, you had mentioned that you speak to your little grandson as, "Hey, little buddy." Does that ever confuse him when you now need to go to correct him as a grandparent?
Well, first of all, he is so smart, so I don't know if that's the case. You know, it could confuse him if I was dad and if I created in him an image that we were equals. But we have such a relationship that even though I'm playing with, he's only 2.5, I'm playing with him and who's your buddy and Grandpa's my buddy. He doesn't know the full meaning of total peer friendship. And so at this point, it's sort of cute. But there may come a day that I may have to be more cautious. There may come a day in which I'm going to, and maybe Dad and Mom are going to have to teach into that Grandpa is not just one of your little friends. Grandpa is someone that we respect. So there may be some ownership that we would have to take as a grandma and grandpa, or even as a mom and dad. It's one of those things, Kathy, that you monitor. And if that's the case, correction needs to be done, do it. We're hoping that in the overall process of your parenting, we'll close with this, as you are learning to respect age, teaching your children to respect age, that you'll find all of the balances that you need. You'll be looking into the context of the moment, as we talked about in the very first session. You'll be looking at your child's overall characterization of behavior. You've got plenty of things to work on. You've got your homework assignment. We've got to keep in mind certainly the key principle for this particular session. It's been a long session. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Okay.